I thought I was dropping off a basket of fruit at my son-in-law's house. Then I saw my wife's car by his gate and heard my name, our house, and the word papers whispered through the curtains. In one breath, I understood this wasn't only infidelity, it was a plan to erase me on paper. Before we begin, get comfortable and listen closely. If you were standing where I stood, would you confront them immediately or stay silent and gather proof? Tell me below and subscribe for the next chapter. My name is Daniel. I am 62 years old, and for most of my life I believed I was a man who had done everything right. I worked hard, stayed loyal to my family, lived without extravagance, and thought the reward for such choices would be peace in my later years. I wasn't chasing greatness, just stability. Yet stability has a way of turning to dust when the people you trust most decide it isn't enough. I grew up with nothing more than calloused hands and an unshakable sense of duty. My father died young. My mother carried us with endless resilience, and I promised myself I would build something better. And so I did one nail, one sale, 1 year at a time. I opened a small hardware store when I was in my 20s, and over 4 decades, it grew from a modest shack with crooked shelves into a well-respected business in our town. It never made me rich, but it gave us security. From the profits, I bought our house outright, then invested in 2 rental units nearby. These weren't castles or empires, just bricks and beams. But to me, they were proof that sweat and sacrifice could turn into something lasting. Clara, my wife, was with me from the beginning. She had a sharp eye for detail, a quiet strength, and the kind of presence that could make any house feel like home. Where I was practical, she was perceptive. She decorated our walls with warmth, kept the books when money was tight, and supported me through the endless cycles of bills, repairs, and late nights at the store. I thought of us as a team. My labor, her care, both poured into the same vessel. Then there was Emily, our only child. From the day she was born, she became the center of my life. Every decision, every dollar saved, every hour worked late at the store was in some way for her. I wanted her to have more than I ever did. And she did college opportunities, a life that stretched beyond the borders of the small town that had confined me. Watching her grow into a confident, driven woman was my proudest achievement. Because of her, I thought about legacy. I never cared much for wealth, but I cared about what I could leave behind. When Emily was finishing high school, I sat down with a lawyer and drafted my will. Everything I had built, the house, the rentals, the store, would pass directly to her. Clara was there with me, nodding in agreement, even helping me phrase the clauses so Emily's future would be protected. I walked out of that office believing I had given my daughter security even after I was gone. For a time, life felt settled. The store ran smoothly, the rentals paid their way, and Emily thrived in her studies. Clara and I had quiet dinners in the kitchen, evenings watching the news, mornings spent in the garden. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. I thought we had weathered the storms of youth and hardship, arriving finally at calm seas. When Emily brought home David, tall, ambitious, and polite, I felt like life had completed its circle. He shook my hand firmly, called me sir with respect, and looked at my daughter as though she were the only person in the room. I liked him from the beginning. I trusted him. More than that, I began to think of him as the son I never had. He showed interest in the store, asking questions about suppliers, margins, property. I thought he wanted to learn from me to carry the business forward someday. I even entertained the idea of handing him more responsibility, showing him how to manage accounts, how to deal with difficult customers, how to keep the books balanced. Clara seemed equally taken with him. She laughed at his jokes, complimented his drive, admired his ideas for the future. I thought it was natural. Why wouldn't she be proud of the man her daughter chose? And so when Emily and David announced their engagement, I felt only joy. The wedding was a blur of music and tears, the kind of day you imagine when you're young and hopeful. Clara and I stood together watching Emily step into her new life, and I thought, this is it. This is the reward for everything we've done. But life has a way of twisting rewards into traps. Over the years, small cracks appeared, ones I ignored because trust is a heavy blindfold. Clara grew restless after Emily moved out. She filled her time with errands, with projects I never saw completed, with visits she claimed were for our daughter, but rarely included her. I told myself it was natural, an empty nest phase, nothing more. But in the quiet of the house, with Emily gone and the rooms too large for just 2 people, I began to notice the silences between us. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I had worked too hard, spent too many years at the store, lost the art of conversation. Maybe Clara's distance was my fault. But there were signs I couldn't ignore. Receipts for places she never mentioned. Phone calls late at night, her voice low in the kitchen. A scarf left in the car with a faint scent of cologne I didn't recognize. I tried to brush them aside, but each detail lodged like a splinter under the skin. David, too, seemed to drift closer to Clara in ways I didn't fully understand. He came by often, even when Emily wasn't around. He lingered after dinner sometimes, helping Clara clean up while I stayed behind to finish my coffee. I thought nothing of it, at least I wanted to think nothing of it. After all, he was family now. Wasn't that what family did? Helped each other, supported each other, filled the gaps. Still, I caught the way Clara's eyes lit up when he entered a room, the way her laughter carried just a little longer when he spoke. I told myself it was admiration, nothing more. I didn't want to see the possibility of anything else. The truth is, I was blind because I wanted to be blind. My whole life had been built on loyalty, on the belief that hard work and devotion meant something. To question that was to question the foundation of everything I had ever done. And so I looked away. But the foundation was already cracking, and beneath it, something darker was moving. Something I wouldn't fully see until that night at the gate, when betrayal showed itself not only in love, but in ink signatures, and the theft of my very name. The first year after Emily's wedding was one of the happiest of my life, or at least that's how I remember it now, before the shadows crept in. Every Sunday, the four of us gathered at our house for dinner. Emily would sit across from me laughing as she told stories about her new job, while David carved the roast chicken with practiced ease. Clara hovered between kitchen and table, fussing over details, always making sure everyone else was comfortable. It was simple, ordinary. And in those moments I thought, this is family complete and whole. I was proud not only of Emily, but of David too. He treated her well, or so it seemed. He thanked Clara for every meal, asked me questions about the store, offered to help with repairs around the house. When the gutters needed clearing, he climbed the ladder without hesitation. When the lock on the shed jammed, he fixed it with a few quick turns. He was the kind of son-in-law men brag about at barbershops, and I often did. Over time, though, I began to notice something I couldn't quite name. It was in the small glances across the table, Clara's laughter lingering just a beat longer when David spoke, his smile directed at her when he poured wine. These moments were fleeting, subtle enough to dismiss, but they left traces in the air like smoke after a candle is blown out. Emily, bless her, seemed oblivious. She was busy building her career, pouring herself into long hours at the office, often tired when she arrived at our Sunday dinners. She leaned on David for support, and to his credit, he appeared to give it. I never doubted her love for him, nor her trust in her mother. Perhaps that's what made it so cruel. Betrayal rarely arrives from strangers. It comes from the hands you thought would hold you steady. Clara began to spend more time helping Emily during the week. She would leave the house with her purse and return hours later saying Emily had been overwhelmed or that David needed an extra hand with something around the house. I didn't question it. Why would I? A mother helping her daughter, a wife helping her son-in-law. It sounded noble, natural. I told myself I was lucky to have such a devoted wife. And yet, there were inconsistencies. One Thursday, Clara said she spent the afternoon with Emily, but when Emily called me that evening, she mentioned she hadn't seen her mother in days. Another time, Clara returned home with her hair slightly undone, cheeks flushed, claiming she had gone shopping, though she carried no bags. I didn't find what I wanted, she said casually. I nodded, forcing myself to believe her. The store, meanwhile, had become a place where David showed particular interest. He dropped by unexpectedly, asking about profits, about property deeds, even about the will I had drafted for Emily. It's good to plan early, he said once, almost too casually, especially with property. Keeps things simple later. I smiled at his interest, though a small unease flickered inside me. It was nothing I could put into words, than just a whisper I ignored. Clara encouraged his involvement. David is so thoughtful, she told me more than once. He cares about your work, about the family's future. You should be grateful. And I was, or at least I pretended to be. In the evenings, I began to notice how often Clara's phone buzzed. She would step outside to answer, her voice hushed, her back turned to me. If I asked who it was, she said it was a friend or Emily or just someone from church. Her answers came too quickly, as though rehearsed. I told myself it was nothing, but each time I felt a small fissure open wider inside me. Still, the love I held for her was stronger than suspicion. 30 years together doesn't crumble overnight. I looked at her across the dinner table, saw the lines on her face that matched the years on mine, and reminded myself of the life we had built. A life that couldn't possibly unravel from a few unanswered questions. Yet even the strongest walls weaken when cracks go unattended. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon. Emily had invited us for lunch, but Clara left early, saying she would help Emily prepare. I decided to surprise them, bringing a bottle of wine as a gift. When I arrived, Emily opened the door with a puzzled look. "Dad," she said, "I didn't know you were coming early. Mom's not here yet." I stood there on the porch, the bottle heavy in my hand, my mind suddenly blank. "Oh," I managed, "maybe she's on her way." Emily shrugged. "I haven't seen her since last week." That night, Clara returned home cheerful, humming a tune as she carried groceries into the kitchen. "Lunch with Emily was wonderful," she said. "We should do it more often." I watched her carefully, the lie sliding off her tongue without effort. My heart ached, not just from suspicion, but from the realization that deception had become natural to her. I didn't confront her. Not then. Instead, I filed it away in the quiet ledger I kept in my mind. Time, place, inconsistency. Each entry was like a stone added to the weight pressing on my chest. By now, the house felt different. The laughter we once shared had turned to strained politeness. Clara's eyes often seemed far away, fixed on thoughts I could not follow. I sat in my armchair at night, staring at the walls, wondering how long she had been slipping from me, and whether I had noticed too late. The truth was approaching, though I didn't know it yet. A truth that would not only expose betrayal of love, but betrayal of legacy, the theft of everything I thought untouchable. As the months passed, what once felt like ordinary family life began to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. The Sunday dinners grew less frequent, not because of Emily, she always wanted us together, but because Clara often found reasons to skip them. A sudden headache, an errand that couldn't wait. Sometimes she insisted we eat without her saying she'd already dined earlier. David would appear alone, shrugging, explaining that Clara had gone home to rest. I remember one evening when Emily was telling us about a new promotion at work. She was glowing with pride, her hands gesturing as she described her responsibilities. I clapped for her, raised my glass in a toast. David congratulated her too, though his eyes drifted often toward the door. And then, without warning, Clara walked in, her hair slightly windswept, cheeks flushed. She claimed she'd been out for a drive. Emily hugged her, delighted she'd come after all. But I watched as Clara's eyes flicked to David, and something unspoken passed between them, quick and sharp as lightning. At the time, I tried to dismiss it, a glance, nothing more. Families share unspoken looks all the time. But this one carried weight, like a secret passing silently in the open. David's role in our lives grew steadily larger. He began offering to help with the rental properties, collecting rent, arranging small repairs. At first I welcomed it. Managing the units was tedious, and I thought it was wise to show him the ropes. But soon I realized he wasn't just helping, he was managing. He spoke to tenants before I did, adjusted leases without consulting me, and once even hinted that it would be simpler if the properties were under joint names. I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was youthful eagerness. In hindsight, it was the first clear sign of a deeper ambition. Clara encouraged him at every turn. "David has such a good head for business," she told me. "You should trust him more. Think about the future when you're gone, who will carry the weight. Don't you want things to run smoothly for Emily?" I nodded, but her words left a bitter taste. The way she said "when you're gone," as though I were already halfway buried. The store, too, became a place where David's presence loomed. He asked me about suppliers, about credit lines, about the deeds. One afternoon, he lingered in the back office, pretending to examine invoices. "You know," he said lightly, "you should think about simplifying ownership, passing things directly through Clara than to Emily. It's cleaner that way, less paperwork down the road." I remember staring at him, the words echoing in my head. Passing things through Clara. Why not directly to Emily, as the will already stated? He smiled when I didn't answer, as though it had only been a suggestion, nothing more. But something in my gut shifted, a knot tightening that wouldn't let go. Clara's distance grew sharper at home. She avoided long conversations, her eyes often fixed on her phone. At night, when I asked her to sit with me, she claimed she was too tired. Once I reached for her hand at the dinner table, and she pulled away as though startled. "Don't," she said softly, glancing toward the window. It was a small word, but it echoed in me for days. I tried to reach her. I asked if something was wrong, if she was unhappy, if I had failed her somehow. She brushed it aside, offering vague reassurances that meant nothing. "I'm just restless," she said. "It's nothing to do with you." But I felt the distance growing like a wall between us, brick by brick. Emily, for her part, noticed none of this. She adored her mother, trusted her husband, and believed our family was unshakable. Once she told me how grateful she was that Clara and David got along so well. "It makes everything easier," she said brightly. "I never have to worry about you clashing with David. Mom loves him almost as much as I do." Her words stabbed at me, though I forced a smile. If only she knew how true they might be, though not in the way she meant. The cracks widened further one autumn evening. Clara left for what she claimed was a church committee meeting. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Finally, I heard the car pull into the driveway. She walked in quietly, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. I asked how the meeting went. She hesitated, then said simply, "Long." Later, when she left her coat draped on a chair, I noticed a faint trace of cologne that wasn't hers, and certainly wasn't mine. I began keeping notes. At first, it was just times and dates, nothing more. But soon I was writing down details receipts for restaurants miles away. Phone calls answered in whispers, explanations that contradicted Emily's words. I didn't know then that this notebook would become the backbone of something larger. All I knew was that I needed to keep track, or else I'd lose myself in doubt. The house became unbearable in its silence. I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, listening to Clara breathe beside me, and wonder where she had truly been. I replayed our life together in my mind, the first apartment we rented, the nights we stayed up talking about dreams, the way she used to lean her head on my shoulder at church. Those memories felt like they belonged to another couple entirely. And through it all, David remained ever present, his shadow stretching across my store, my rentals, my family. I told myself he was just eager, just ambitious, just wanting to prove himself. But deep down I sensed the truth. Ambition is rarely content with helping. It always wants more. By the time winter came, I knew something was wrong, not just in my marriage, but in the foundation of everything I had built. I just didn't yet know how deep the rot went, or how close it was to consuming me entirely. When I look back over the decades of my marriage, it is almost impossible to reconcile the woman I see now with the woman I first fell in love with. Clara was 19 when we met. She was working at a small bakery in town, her hair pulled back under a scarf, her hands dusted with flour. I was 22, fresh out of trade school, already dreaming of opening my own hardware shop. She smiled when she handed me a loaf of bread, and that smile carried me through the week. Those were lean years. I rented a cramped apartment above a garage, and Clara lived with her parents, helping them with chores. But what we lacked in comfort, we made up for in hope. We would walk for hours on summer nights talking about futures we could barely afford to imagine, her wanting a home with a garden, me dreaming of shelves stocked with tools and supplies, a store where I could be my own boss. When we married, we had almost nothing. Our first apartment was furnished with hand-me-downs, the wallpaper peeling, the floorboards squeaking. I worked 12-hour shifts unloading trucks while trying to save enough to buy inventory for the shop. Clara picked up sewing jobs for neighbors, patching their dresses and curtains late into the night by the dim light of a desk lamp. There were weeks when we ate little more than bread and soup, but somehow we laughed through it all. The day the hardware store opened was one of the proudest of my life. Clara stood beside me as we unlocked the doors for the first time. The shelves weren't full, but they were ours. We lived frugally, pouring every extra cent back into the business. Slowly it grew. Regular customers came to know me by name. Contractors trusted my advice. Clara helped with the bookkeeping, her neat handwriting filling ledger after ledger. She kept me honest when my optimism outran our budget. Then Emily was born, and our world changed forever. I had never held anything so small, so fragile, and yet so powerful. She became the center of our universe. I worked longer hours to provide, and Clara became both mother and teacher, pouring herself into raising our daughter. She read to her every night, braided her hair in the mornings, and taught her to sing while kneading dough in the kitchen. Those were the golden years. Money was tight, yes, but there was warmth in the walls. I remember coming home after 14-hour days, exhausted to the bone, and hearing Emily's laughter echoing down the hall. Clara would be stirring stew at the stove, humming that little tune of hers, the same one that later would haunt me like a ghost. I would kiss Emily on the forehead, set my calloused hands on Clara's shoulders, and think, this is enough. This is everything. But golden years don't last forever. As Emily grew, our lives shifted. We moved into the house I had worked so hard to buy with a porch. I built myself in a garden Clara filled with roses. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. I began to think about the future, not mine, but Emily's. That's when I started to acquire the rental units. One at first, then another, each a small but steady stream of income. Clara approved, or at least she said she did. She liked the security, the promise that Emily would never struggle as we had. I remember the day I told Clara I wanted to make a will. Emily was finishing high school, and the thought of her stepping into adulthood made me keenly aware of my own mortality. Clara sat beside me at the lawyer's office, her hand resting lightly on mine. I signed the papers, leaving everything house rental store to Emily. "It's the right thing," Clara said softly. "She deserves it all," I believed her. For a while, life settled into routine. Emily excelled at school, then went off to college. Clara and I grew accustomed to the quiet house. I thought those evenings, just the two of us in the kitchen, were a reward for all the sacrifices we had made. I would glance at her across the table, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes tired but kind, and feel a quiet gratitude. But even then, looking back now, I can see the first signs of distance. Clara began spending more time outside the home, volunteering, running errands, attending events I wasn't invited to. I encouraged her, thinking it was good for her to have her own pursuits. I had the store, after all, and she deserved something for herself. I didn't realize that sometimes something for herself can become someone else. At Emily's college graduation, we stood together as proud parents watching her walk across the stage. David was there too, just a friend at that time, though I could see in his eyes the way he looked at her. Clara noticed too. She leaned over and whispered, "He'll be important to her someday." I laughed, brushing it off. But Clara was rarely wrong about such things. I never imagined how right she would be, or how devastating that importance would become. Emily's adult life unfolded the way good lives do, without fanfare. She finished college, took an entry-level position at a marketing firm, and learned to navigate a world that didn't care how many late nights she worked as long as the campaign launched on time. She called me on her walks home, telling me about clients and impossible deadlines, the way office politics felt like a game everyone else had been taught, and she had to learn by watching. I listened, proud and useless, wishing I could fix the invisible things that tire a young person out more than labor ever tired me. David stepped into those years like a man stepping onto a stage he'd rehearsed for. He showed up when Emily needed him, bought groceries, when she forgot, learned her coffee order, drove her to appointments, laughed at the right places. He wore responsibility like a fitted suit. I was grateful, and I said so in front of them, to Clara, to anyone who would listen. "He's a good one," I'd say. "He'll make a steady life." Clara always agreed quickly, warmly, as if she'd been waiting for me to say it. After the wedding, their home became a second hearth for us. The first time I visited, David gave me the tour as if he'd built it himself. Open-plan kitchen, an office that would someday be a nursery, a small back deck overlooking a patch of grass that was more hope than lawn. He asked about shelving for the garage, about weatherproofing the windows, about how I'd laid the joists in our old porch. He watched my hands as I explained, like a student, eager not to miss a step. "Teach me the store," he said, almost boyish. "Not just the front counter, the bones." So I did. Over the months, I showed him the tedious parts, the inventory log that never matches the floor, the supplier who's always late until you threaten to walk the way you judge a contractor from how he treats the kid sweeping the aisle. He listened well. He asked questions. He started keeping a small notebook, and I pretended not to notice the columns where he'd copied my margins. It felt like legacy, not intrusion. I mistook attention for respect. Clara encouraged all of it. She had a way in those days of orbiting between us, asking David if he'd eaten, reminding me to bring the store keys, noting things that needed fixing in our house with a lightness that made every request sound like care. On Sundays, she baked too much on purpose and sent half home with Emily and David. "You'll need leftovers," she'd say, tucking foil around the dish, her hand brushing David's wrist just once, like punctuation. If I noticed that touch, I told myself it meant nothing. I had seen her brush crumbs from Emily's sleeve 1,000 times with the same absent tenderness. What is love but the repetition of small gestures until they look like habits? Slowly, the habits shifted. Clara started visiting Emily's house during the week to help with cooking or to drop off something. Sometimes she'd text me that she'd be late and not to wait up. Sometimes she wouldn't text at all. The first time I asked about it, she laughed an easy liquid sound and said, "You know how your daughter is. She tries to do too much. I'm just making sure she doesn't burn out." I nodded, relieved to be included in the circle of women who understand one another, relieved that my job was to be steady and quiet and grateful. But the circle kept widening and I kept standing outside it. I'd walk into a room and conversation would stop mid-sentence. I'd step onto a porch and catch the last fresh echo of a laugh that didn't sound like it belonged to me. Words are slippery things. What gave them away wasn't what they said, but how quickly they said it. Just a church meeting, a book club you wouldn't like. Emily needed me. The answers came fast, polished by practice. The first hard pebble in my shoe was a receipt. It fell out of Clara's purse when she pulled her gloves free, thin paper-slick ink. A wine bar across town, 2 glasses, a cheese plate, a bottle with a vintage we would never order. Clara doesn't drink wine. She says it gives her headaches. I picked up the slip and smoothed it on the counter. She looked at it, smiled too brightly, and said, "Sandra's birthday. You remember Sandra?" I did. She had moved away 5 years earlier. I didn't correct her. I folded the receipt and put it in the drawer with batteries and string. After that, the small wrong notes multiplied. I'd wake at 2 in the morning and find the glow of her phone under the quilt lighting her face from below like a secret. I'd step into the hall and hear the back door ease shut on a whisper of night air. On a rainy Thursday, I called Emily to see if she needed a ride, and she answered from a restaurant downtown. Laughter and plates and friends loud behind her. "Mom's not with me," she said when I asked without asking. Why, I told her I must have misheard. "Tell Mom to come too next time," she added. I said I would. The store stopped being refuge and started being evidence. To keep from drowning in possibilities, I did the only thing that has ever calmed me. I counted. I started a notebook, the smallest one we sell by the register, and wrote dates and times the way I'd tally lag bolts and washers, not because I wanted to catch her, but because I needed to know if I was losing my mind. On one page, I wrote, "Thursday church meeting, 11:40 p.m. home. On the next Sunday, helping Emily at brunch." In the back, I wrote nothing, just pressed the pen hard into the paper where a man might pray if he still knew how. David kept sliding almost imperceptibly into places that had once been mine. He coordinated a lease renewal without asking me, and then texted the tenant like he owned the deed. He introduced himself to a supplier by my first name when he picked up a late pallet. It made it easier, he told me, grinning. He recognized the store name. I watched him, the way he had begun to take a step ahead of me, through doors, the way he'd reach for checks when the bill arrived and sign without looking up. It wasn't arrogance, it was rehearsal. If there was a moment I can point to and say that was the breath before the plunge, it was after a Sunday dinner when Emily had gone to bed early with a headache and the house felt deflated without her laughter. Clara was rinsing plates, sleeves rolled, wrists bare. David stood beside her, drying too close, not obscenely close, just comfortably. Clara said, "We should think about simplifying things," and I, a fool, asked what she meant. "The store paperwork," she said, eyes on the pan under the tap. "It's all in your name, and then to Emily. Maybe it should pass through me first to make it smoother, in case of anything." David didn't look at me, but he nodded just once, as if agreeing with an argument already won. The sound the pan made when he set it on the rack was so gentle it felt like politeness weaponized. I went to bed early that night and lay on my side facing the wall. Clara slid in behind me, her palm light on my shoulder, her thumb moving once absent-minded as if I were a pet she was fond of. It would make a better story if I said I flinched, if I said I rolled away from her touch. I didn't. I lay there and let myself be gentled because memory is a muscle, and mine remembered being loved. Winter came hard. The store heater coughed at the worst times, and the cold found all the old seams in our house. I caught the flu for the first time in years and spent 2 days shivering on the couch while Clara moved through the rooms as if caring for a stranger, tea left just out of reach. Soup warmed but cooling before I woke. David texted to ask if I needed anything, and I typed no thanks with hands that felt too big for the letters. In my fever, I dreamed of the first house Clara and I rented, the light on the bedroom wall, shifting as cars passed, the sound of her voice in the dark saying, "We'll make it like a promise you could build a staircase from." When the fever broke, so did something else. I found a charge on our joint account for notarial services initial consultation. It was tucked between utilities and the gas bill, small enough to hide unless you're looking for reasons not to sleep. The date matched an evening Clara had claimed to be at a church meeting. I took my notebook out and copied the line, and my hand didn't shake at all. I started walking in the evenings under the false pretense of exercise. Our neighborhood is old enough to have uneven sidewalks, the kind that make you watch your step, and the houses are close enough that you can smell what your neighbors are cooking. I walked past David and Emily's street more than once, timing my pace to make it look accidental if anyone saw me. I watched the rhythm of their lights: kitchen, then living room, then bedroom. Some nights there was an extra pattern: the porch light off, then on again, a pause, then off. A signal to know when, I told myself. A timer, a thing with a broken switch. When I did see Clara's car in their driveway for the first time at an hour that had no excuse. My body made the decision, my mind wouldn't. I kept walking. Past their hedge, past Mrs. Patel's geraniums, asleep under burlap, past the mailbox that needed repainting. I walked until my knees complained, and then I turned toward home and wrote down the time in the notebook as neatly as I write purchase orders. A week later, Emily called me from the grocery store, arguing with a self-checkout machine, laughing breathlessly. "Mom's been so busy," she said when I asked how she was. "She hardly sits down. She's a force of nature." I pictured Clara's hands on David's sink. Clara's voice leaning in when he leaned in, and I said, "She always has been." I said it like pride. There are sentences that only reveal themselves later as confessions. One evening the doorbell rang at dinner time, and David stood there with a paper bag and measured concern. "Thought you might want soup," he said to Clara. Not me, as if the house had always been parceled so. He set the bag down. Unwrapped containers moved in my kitchen with such ease that I felt like a guest in my own life. When he left, Clara said, "He's thoughtful," and I said, "He is," because the truth is sometimes indistinguishable from the story covering it. The night that stands like a ledger line between before and after came with rain. I had closed the store early because the back door wouldn't seal, and the floor took water like an old boat. I drove toward home through a gray so thick the streetlights felt underwater. As I passed the turn that leads to Emily's street, I saw, even through the smear of the wipers, a shape I knew too well. The arc of Clara's taillights, the way her brake light flares when she taps it lightly, a habit I could identify, the way a husband recognizes his wife's footfall in a crowd. I turned without thinking and followed at a distance my better self would call cowardly, and my honest self calls necessary. She stopped at the curb. The porch light flicked on, then off. David opened the door, and the rectangle of warm interior swallowed them both like a mouth. I drove on around the block, around the next, and only when I hit the main road did I remember to breathe. At home, I found the notebook and wrote down everything I could without writing the word I would not yet allow my hand. Then I placed the notebook in the drawer with batteries and string and the wine receipt and shut it with the quiet care of a man putting a sleeping child to bed. Grief doesn't arrive as a trumpet. It arrives as a calendar. I started counting differently after that night, not the days since our wedding or the years since the store opened, but the intervals between the truth and me. Each morning, I woke and promised myself that today I would ask, and each night I chose the kind of silence that resembles love if you don't look too closely. I told myself I was protecting Emily. I told myself I was gathering my courage. I told myself many useful things. What I was really doing was preparing to see. And once you see, you cannot unsee. You can only decide what to do with the knowledge. There's a kind of blindness that isn't about the eyes, it's about the heart. I had lived with Clara for more than 30 years, shared a bed, a table, a child, and still I refused to see her as anything but the girl I married. Even when the proof stacked up, I clung to the image I'd carried for decades. Clara smiling in our first apartment sleeves, rolled stirring soup on a stove that barely worked. Maybe that's why the truth had to hit me so hard, so brutally, before I would finally stop pretending. The night I saw her car at David's house was not the first time suspicion turned into certainty. It was the night I could no longer deny what my gut had been screaming for months. But the weeks before that night, those were the crucible. They were the weeks that carved the suspicion deep into me until it became part of my bones. It started with money. I've always been meticulous about accounts. Running a small store teaches you to watch every dollar. When a supplier is late, when a shipment is short, when the electric bill spikes, you notice. So when I saw new charges on our joint account, I noticed. Restaurants in parts of town Clara never visited. Hotel bars billed in the afternoon. Notarial services again. At first I convinced myself it was a mistake, a misprint, a stolen card number, but when I asked Clara, she answered too quickly, her story ready before I finished my question. That's when I understood the difference between an error and a lie. An error confuses you. A lie reassures you too smoothly. Then there were the phone calls. She had grown secretive, keeping her phone with her at all times, even bringing it to the bathroom. One evening she set it down for just a moment while folding laundry. The screen lit up, and I saw his name, David. My stomach dropped. I didn't pick it up, didn't snoop, I didn't have to. A son-in-law doesn't call his mother-in-law late at night unless something is deeply wrong. She grabbed the phone, muttered something about Emily using it, and left the room before I could answer. The next day, Emily told me she hadn't spoken to her mother all week. The pieces clicked, cruel and undeniable. I began keeping track of her absences with more precision. I wasn't a detective, I was just a husband trying to measure the distance growing between us. But the more I wrote down, the more the pattern became clear. Thursday night church meeting home at midnight, Friday shopping trip, no bags, Saturday visiting Emily, but Emily at lunch with friends. The ledger filled itself, and yet I stayed silent. That's the part I hate to remember, the silence. I could have confronted her, I could have demanded the truth, but silence is sometimes the last defense of a man who already knows the answer. If I didn't ask, maybe it wasn't real. If I didn't accuse, maybe the marriage still existed. So I held my tongue even as the truth carved itself into my heart. But silence doesn't stop the world from moving. It only delays the crash. One evening I returned home earlier than expected. The house was empty, but on the counter sat a folder she had left behind. Inside were papers I had never seen before, financial drafts, property documents, something about restructuring ownership. My name was there, but faint like an afterthought. Clara's name, bold. David's in notes on the margin. My hands shook as I read, and I realized this was bigger than infidelity. They weren't just sharing secrets. They were planning to erase me on paper, to cut me out of the very life I had built. That night, Clara returned humming, carrying groceries, as though nothing had happened. I stared at her across the dinner table, imagining the weight of the papers still sitting in my desk drawer. She smiled, asked about the store, and passed me the salt. I answered mechanically. But inside, something was dying. The following week, the betrayals grew sharper. Clara began speaking to David with a familiarity that went beyond family. At gatherings, their eyes found each other too quickly, their conversations too private. Once, during a Sunday dinner, Clara reached for the wine bottle at the same time David did. Their fingers brushed, lingered. Emily didn't notice, but I did. I saw everything. I remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, hearing Clara's steady breathing beside me. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The woman I had built everything for, the woman I trusted beyond reason, was already gone. And the man I had welcomed into our family, the man I had trusted with my daughter's future, was stealing mine. So I began to prepare. Quietly, secretly, the way a man prepares for a storm he knows is coming. I copied bank statements. I photographed receipts. I tucked away drafts of documents. I wrote down every inconsistency, every late night, every whispered phone call. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but I knew I couldn't stay blind forever. And still, through all of it, a part of me hoped I was wrong, hoped I would wake one morning and find Clara in the kitchen, humming, her hands dusted with flour like the girl I once met in the bakery. Hoped David was simply eager, ambitious, nothing more. Hoped Emily would never have to see her world shatter. But hope is a cruel thing. It keeps you standing still while the ground crumbles beneath your feet. And when I finally saw Clara's car at David's gate, when I heard my own name whispered through their window alongside words like papers and transfer, I knew hope had been lying to me all along. That was the end of the backstory, though I didn't know it then. Everything before that night was prelude. Everything after would be war. The night at David's gate is burned into me like a scar. I remember the smell of wet leaves on the ground, the hum of street lamps, the way my hands trembled against the steering wheel as I parked 2 houses down. I had told myself I was only passing through, that I wouldn't stop, that I didn't want to know, but my body betrayed me. I shut off the engine, stepped out, and walked slowly toward the hedge that bordered his property. Clara's car was there, parked as though it belonged, angled close to the curb, as if she had done it many times before. My throat tightened. I edged closer, heart hammering, until I could hear voices through a cracked window. At first I wasn't sure, but then I recognized the cadence, Clara's voice sharp and low, followed by David's calm and steady. I leaned in, holding my breath. "We can't wait much longer," Clara said. "He's getting suspicious." David's reply was measured. "Suspicion isn't proof. As long as he doesn't have anything in writing, we're safe." Something in me twisted. Proof, safe. What could they possibly need safety from? "Emily will never forgive us," Clara whispered. "She won't have to know?" David said quickly. "By the time the transfers are complete, it'll be clean. She'll just believe it's about protecting her inheritance." The words struck me harder than a fist. Transfers, inheritance. They weren't just speaking about their affair, they were speaking about my will, my house, the store, everything I had spent my life building. I staggered back from the window bile, rising in my throat. The basket of fruit I had brought slipped from my grip apple, spilling silently onto the gravel. I forced myself not to run, not to make a sound. I walked back to my car in slow, careful steps, each one heavier than the last. Driving home felt like wading through fire. My vision blurred, and I clenched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I replayed their words over and over in my head. Suspicion isn't proof. Transfers. Inheritance. When I reached the house, it looked exactly as it always had, the porch light glowing, the roses by the steps nodding gently in the breeze. But inside, everything was different. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the walls that had once held laughter and realized they were plotting not only to betray me in love, but to erase me entirely. That night, Clara returned close to midnight. She slipped through the door, humming softly, carrying a paper bag as though she had just come from errands. I watched her silently from the table. "You're still up?" she asked, startled. I forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep." She nodded, avoiding my eyes, and carried the bag into the kitchen. I picked up a few things for the pantry. I didn't ask what. I didn't mention David. Instead, I studied her carefully, noting the flush in her cheeks, the faint trace of perfume she rarely wore for me. She moved through the room with casual ease, as though she had nothing to hide. Inside, my rage boiled. But I swallowed it. Rage would give me nothing. Proof would give me everything. That night when she slept, I went to my desk and pulled out the notebook I had started months earlier. I opened a fresh page and wrote in clear, deliberate letters, David's house, Clara's car, words, overheard, transfers, inheritance. It was the first entry that turned suspicion into certainty. Over the next days, I became an actor in my own life. I smiled when Clara spoke, answered her questions with calm politeness, sat with her at dinner as though nothing had changed. But beneath the mask, I was watching recording gathering. I copied bank statements highlighting charges that didn't fit. I photographed receipts when she wasn't looking. I checked her purse when she left it unattended, finding drafts of documents that mentioned trusts and joint management. Each discovery was a knife, but I forced myself to bear it. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. They weren't only lovers, they were conspirators. Clara had started the process of rewriting the will, shifting assets into joint accounts, creating a framework that would leave me stripped of authority. David was advising her, helping to mask the moves as acts of protection for Emily. They thought they were clever, that they could hide behind legal language. But paper leaves trails, and I was following every step. Still, I felt the weight of secrecy pressing down on me. Emily remained oblivious, her trust in her mother and her husband unbroken. She called me often, chatting about work, asking if I was eating well, never suspecting the storm gathering above her head. Each time I heard her voice, my resolve hardened. I couldn't let Clara and David succeed. I couldn't let Emily inherit lies instead of legacy. One evening, Clara mentioned casually that David had offered to help restructure some of the property accounts. She framed it as efficiency, as simplifying paperwork. "It'll be better for Emily," she said. I nodded, hiding my fury. "You might be right," I murmured. Inside, I vowed, "You will never touch what belongs to her, not while I'm alive." That was the beginning of the conflict, not an explosion, but a slow burn. Every day, every lie, every falsified smile fed the fire inside me. And though they didn't know it yet, the man they thought was broken was already preparing for war. For 3 days after the night at the gate, I behaved like a man who had accepted defeat. I kept the store open, swept the aisles, stacked the salt bags by the door as if winter hadn't already set in. I ate what Clara set in front of me and said thank you. I slept beside her and matched my breathing to hers. I moved quietly as though grief were a porcelain thing that might shatter if I made a sudden sound. Underneath the quiet wasn't surrender, it was scaffolding. Mark called me back the morning of the fourth day. I had sent him a message with no details, only, "I have to protect Emily. Tell me how to do this without screaming." He poured coffee while I spoke in his office, and he didn't interrupt even once. When I finished, he tapped a knuckle against his mug and said, "You're going to build a record. Not a story stories can be argued with. A record. Dates, documents, times, independent corroboration, and you're going to stay inside the lines of the law, even when your blood tells you to jump the rails." How, I asked. He slid a legal pad across to me. "Start a timeline with objective anchors. Bank statements, call logs, calendar entries, travel receipts. If there's a neighbor with a doorbell camera, ask politely. If there's a notary appointment, there'll be a ledger. If you record only conversations you're a party to. Don't break into anything. Don't bug cars. Don't touch accounts you don't own." He looked up at me. "Stay steady. The point isn't vengeance, it's clarity." I left his office with a list and a steadiness that felt like armor. That afternoon, I copied our joint statements and highlighted charges that matched the nights Clara said church or book club. The wine bar appeared like a refrain. Twice there were small charges from a legal office whose name I recognized only because I had driven past it for years without ever going in. I printed call logs from our carrier, the family plan that had once felt like convenience, now like an X-ray. The pattern was obscene in its neatness, late-night calls to David's number on the same days as the committee meetings. I took the notebook I'd started and transcribed everything cleanly as if copying a recipe you can't risk getting wrong. Then I made 3 copies of the notebook and hid them in 3 different places: the strongbox, the bottom drawer, beneath the paint stir sticks at the store, and an envelope taped under the false bottom of my tool chest. It wasn't paranoia. It was the muscle memory of a man who's kept a family business alive through supply shocks and downturns. Never keep your only copy where a single leak can ruin it. I walked Emily Street the next day just before sunset and stopped at Mrs. Patel's porch. She's the sort of neighbor who has made hospitality into an art, a chair, always waiting, a plant always being coaxed into bloom. She opened the door before I'd finished knocking her eyes, taking a quick inventory of the worry on my face. "Can I ask a favor?" I said. "And if the answer is no, I'll never bring it up again." She tilted her head. "Come in, Daniel." I sat at her kitchen table and chose my words like I was disarming a trap. "Have you noticed Clara's car here lately? I don't want you in the middle of anything. I'm trying to understand patterns I can't ignore anymore." I didn't add the rest, that the woman I loved had turned my life into a maze. Mrs. Patel's eyes softened, and the kindness in them nearly undid me. "I don't gossip," she said gently, "but I also don't pretend not to see things that should be seen. Yes, a few times a week, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes late. I mind my own business, but I have a doorbell camera. I can share the timestamps with you if that helps you." "Steady yourself, it helps," I said, and had to press my hand flat against the table to keep from shaking. She emailed the clips that evening, short silent videos stamped with date and time: Clara's car slipping into the curb at 2:17 p.m. Clara walking up the path at 7:42 p.m., blue scarf bright against her coat, leaving at 11:56 p.m., hair undone by wind. In another, David opens the door with the posture of a man receiving something he expects. I forwarded the files to Mark with a single subject line: "Anchor points." He replied within minutes: "Good. Keep building the chain." The next link came from the unlikeliest place, the county recorder's office. I went under the pretext of checking a lien release on the store property. The clerk at the window recognized me. Small towns are nosy in ways that save you as often as they trap you. When she returned my paperwork, I asked casual light how long it takes to record changes to a deed or to place property into a trust. She shrugged, told me the timeline, and added, "We've been busy, lots of folks moving things into living trusts lately. Keeps probate simple." She tapped a stack behind her. "We log preliminary transfer docs by intake date. Want me to check your name's been quiet?" She typed, "You're clear." She paused. "Clara's been in, though. Intake only, nothing recorded yet." She looked up quickly as if she'd said too much. "Sorry, shouldn't have." "It's okay," I said, and my voice surprised me by not breaking. "You've helped me remember something I needed to remember." I thanked her, and stepped into the sunlight with my heart thudding like a drum. At home, Clara had left a manila folder on the desk, perhaps assuming the tidiness of the house would hide it the way tidy words had hidden her. Inside, informational brochures from 2 different banks about revocable trusts, beneficiary designations, and something called successor trustees. On one page, the hypothetical trustees were listed as Clara Bennett and David Martin. Hypothetical like a weather forecast, like an accident waiting for an intersection. There was also a questions to ask your notary sheet creased at the corners. I photographed every page, then put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. That night, I invited David to meet me at the store early the next morning. "Want your opinion on expanding the lawn and garden section," I said, thinking about moving a little capital around. It sounded enough like a compliment to lure him. We stood among the wheelbarrows and birdseed before the sun found the windows. I had slipped a small recorder into my breast pocket, not a wire, not a hidden bug. I was a party to the conversation. The words, if they came, would be gifts they offered freely. I've been thinking I began cool as a ledger. Maybe Clara's right. Maybe we should simplify things, make sure the properties in the store are positioned to pass smoothly, if something happened to me. I let the sentence trail off like a rope over a well. He nodded, eager. Exactly. You want things to be seamless. A trust does that. Honestly, if you put Clara and me as co-trustees, now it saves Emily a headache later. She doesn't like paperwork. She doesn't. I agreed. And how would we structure that? He was ready, too ready. He walked me through it as if he'd practiced in a mirror deed transfers into the trust bank accounts, retitled the store operating as an asset under the trust umbrella so you're not technically on the hook. Personally, he added a carrot for a man who worries about liability. We keep your will in place as a backstop, he said, but the trust governs the day-to-day. Cleaner, safer. Cleaner, I repeated as if tasting a new word. And who signs? Initially you and Clara. Then successor trustees me in case she's overwhelmed. He smiled. She trusts me. Emily does too. Of course, I said, and for the first time the words cut my mouth as they left it. When he left, I sat on the stool behind the counter and listened to the recording through headphones. There was no bravado in his voice, no cackle. Just confidence, calm and technical, the tone of a man who cannot imagine he is doing anything but the efficient thing. I saved the file, copied it to 2 drives, labeled them Garden A and Garden B, and hid one in the false bottom of the till where I keep petty cash. That afternoon, I stopped at the notary's office, whose name kept showing up on our statements. "There's a strange charge on my account," I said, holding out the paper. "If it's an error, I'll need to dispute it." The receptionist glanced at it and said, "Oh, that's not an error. Mrs. Bennett had an initial consultation. We log every visit for compliance." She hesitated. "We can't disclose documents, obviously, but if you're disputing the charge—" "I'm not disputing it," I said, keeping my voice mild. "I just wanted to be sure my account wasn't compromised." She turned a ledger toward herself and ran a finger down a column. "It's paid. The note says, review of trust options." She looked up. "You can always set an appointment together. It makes things go more smoothly." "Maybe we will," I said, and thanked her with a smile that felt like dental work. The next thing Mark told me to get was a witness outside the family, not to testify, not yet, but to ground the story. Someone who can say, "You didn't sound like a man imagining things he'd said." Someone who saw her car when you heard the kind of calls you heard, noticed the frequency. I thought of the clerk at the recorder's office. I thought of Mrs. Patel's camera. I thought of Mr. Hernandez, the tenant in Unit 2, who had texted me 2 weeks earlier. "Your son-in-law stopped by about the lease. Should I be talking to him or you?" I pulled the thread. I visited Mr. Hernandez to inspect a leaky sink I'd already repaired last month. "You mentioned David about the lease," I said casually as I tightened a nut that didn't need tightening. "Yeah," he said. "He was friendly. Said he was helping you and Clara reorganize that paperwork, might come with a new mailing address. I just wanted to be sure it wasn't a scam." He shrugged. Seemed official. "Thanks for checking," I said. "If anything changes, you'll hear it from me in writing." When I left, I sat in my truck and wrote the exchange down while it was still warm. Then I drove to the bank and spoke to the branch manager I've known since he was a teller. I didn't accuse. I asked questions. If someone wanted to retitle a joint account into the name of a trust without both account holders present, could they? He shook his head. "Not here," he said. "Both signatures in person or notarized. And we video confirm those now. New policy since last year." "Good," I said. I'm revisiting our arrangement soon. Thought I'd get my facts straight first. I went home, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was drowning. The evidence had shape now. It wasn't a storm. It was a map. That night, Clara came into the living room with a glass of water and a softness in her voice I hadn't heard in months. "You've been quiet lately," she said, sitting where she used to sit when the news was on. "Are you all right?" I looked at her and chose the truth that contained more truth. "I'm tired," I said, "and I've been thinking about the future." Her eyes brightened in the smallest, cruelest way. "I have too," she said carefully. "It might be time to make some changes. For Emily's sake." "For Emily's sake," I echoed. "Maybe we talk to that notary together." She hit it well, but I saw the flicker, the recalculation. "Yes," she said. "Together. That would be best." When she went to bed, I sat in the hush she left behind and wrote one sentence in the notebook that felt like a hinge. "They believe they're ahead of me." I backed up the new pages, labeled the folder on my desktop. Receipt spring, printed, dated, sealed, and slid another envelope into Mark's hands the next morning. He read the summary and exhaled. "This is enough to stop any quiet transfer and enough to make any decent person tell Emily everything." He tapped the file that held Mrs. Patel's timestamps, the notary ledger note. "David's own words about trustees. Keep your powder dry," he said. "We'll choose the ground. Family gathering," I said. Surprising myself with how firm it sounded. A room full of people who love her. Let the truth walk in upright. He nodded once. "Then we build to that." The last thing I did that week was the simplest, and it steadied me more than anything else. I went to the bank where I keep the original will. I asked to see it, and in the small viewing room with the door closed, I read every line the way a man reads a letter from the front, aware that the person who wrote it might not come home. Everything to Emily. I slid it back into its jacket and signed the access log with a hand that no longer shook. When I left the bank, the air smelled like rain, and the first drops hit my face with the unceremonious honesty of weather. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel brave. I felt prepared, which is quieter and heavier, and in its own way more dangerous. I drove home past David's street without looking and pulled into my own driveway. The porch light came on as it always had, indifferent to the war it illuminated. I unlocked the door, stepped inside the house that still answered to my key, and set the notebook on the table where I could see it. The cover was worn soft from use. I smoothed it with my palm. Tomorrow, I told myself, tomorrow we build the next piece. I learned long ago that when a beam is rotten, you don't strike it with a hammer right away. You test it, you press lightly, see how deep the decay runs. That's what I began to do with Clara and David. Set small traps. Soft questions, moments where their answers would betray more than their words intended. One evening over dinner, I asked Clara casually, "Did Emily mention her new project to you?" I already knew she hadn't seen Emily that week. Clara blinked, then smiled too quickly. "Yes," she told me all about it. My heart clenched. She didn't even ask what project. She just reached for the salt, humming softly as though one more lie could disappear under seasoning. The next day I visited David at his office. I brought coffee, set it on his desk like a peace offering. "Been thinking about retirement," I said. "The store's getting heavy. Maybe I should hand the reins over." His eyes lit up in a way that betrayed him. He leaned forward eagerly. "That would be smart." "You've worked enough, Daniel. Let us take some weight off. Us, not Emily, not even Clara. Us." I sipped my coffee and smiled as though I hadn't heard the slip. But inside, my stomach burned. Every word they spoke confirmed what I already knew. They were rehearsing a future that didn't include me. I decided then that if they were rehearsing, I would direct the stage. I told Clara one Saturday morning I've been thinking of updating the will. Things have changed since Emily got married. Maybe we should add David as a backup just in case. Her face brightened too much too quickly. She touched my arm. "That's wise. He's practically a son already." I nodded, forcing myself not to pull away. Her eagerness was its own confession. That afternoon, while she was out running errands, I pulled the manila folder from her desk drawer again. More drafts, notes scribbled in her hand. Words like trustee, executor, transfer of property. My name faded further with each new page as though I were a ghost fading from my own life. I photographed everything, slid it back and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Each day I had to sit across from her, listen to her voice, pretend I didn't know. Each day I had to shake David's hand when he stopped by the store, pretending I didn't hear his voice in my recorder calmly outlining how he would become trustee over assets that weren't his. But the more I waited, the more they slipped. Greed makes people careless. One night Clara forgot to silence her phone before bed. A message buzzed at 11:32 p.m. She snatched it up, but not before I saw the preview flash. "We'll finalize next week." De-finalize. The word echoed in my head all night. The following week I asked Mark to file preliminary notices with the bank and the county recorder flagging any attempt to alter ownership of my properties without my signature. "It's a stopgap," he explained. "Not permanent, but it buys us time. If they try to act, the system will choke on the paperwork." I nodded. Time was all I needed now. Time to gather enough that when the truth came out, it wouldn't just be my word against theirs. It would be undeniable. And so, I set another trap. I invited Clara and David for dinner, just the three of us, Emily working late that night. I roasted a chicken, opened a bottle of wine. We sat at the table like a family, though the air was thick with unspoken things. Midway through the meal, I leaned back and sighed. "You know," I said, "I'm not as strong as I used to be. Some nights I wonder what will happen when I'm gone." Clara reached for my hand, her face arranged into concern. "Don't say that." David leaned forward, his tone careful, measured. "That's why we've been talking about restructuring Daniel. You shouldn't carry this alone. If you let us help now, things will be smoother later. Emily won't have to worry." I studied them both, letting the silence stretch. "You're right," I said finally. "Maybe we should formalize it soon." The relief that flickered across Clara's face was all the proof I needed. They believed I was yielding, that I was ready to hand them the keys. But I wasn't yielding. I was baiting the hook. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table long into the night, staring at the empty plates, the wine glasses smeared with fingerprints. They had played their parts perfectly, but they didn't realize I was the one writing the script now. Mark helped me organize everything. The bank statements, the receipts, the notary charges, the video timestamps from Mrs. Patel, the recording of David explaining trusteeships, the text message preview. Piece by piece, it formed a chain that no lie could break. Still, part of me ached with the weight of it. This wasn't just evidence against strangers. It was against the woman I had loved for decades and the man I had trusted as family. I sat with that ache, let it bleed through me, and reminded myself why I was doing it. For Emily, for the truth, for the dignity they thought they could steal from me. And as the family gathering drew closer, the one where all of us would sit together to celebrate Aunt Margaret's birthday, I knew that would be the stage. Not a courtroom, not a private argument, a room full of family, a place where masks couldn't survive. They thought they were walking into a party. They didn't know they were walking into judgment. The weeks before Aunt Margaret's birthday felt like waiting for a storm you can see on the horizon. Black clouds thickening, thunder rolling closer, yet everyone around you keeps setting tables in the garden as though the sky were clear. Clara moved through the house with a lightness that was almost cruel. She hummed while folding laundry, tapped her fingers against the counter, while boiling tea, smiled when David's name lit her phone. She thought she had already won. David, too, seemed more confident. He stopped by the store less, but when he did, he carried himself with the ease of someone who believed the future already belonged to him. Once, as he leaned against the counter, he said, "You've built something solid here, Daniel. Most men your age are just hoping Social Security holds out." He smiled that calm, measured smile. "It'll be easier when things transition. Cleaner, cleaner." That word again rehearsed between them until it sounded natural. I answered evenly, "Yes, transitions are important." Inside, I tightened my grip on the ledger until the paper crinkled under my fingers. Meanwhile, Emily bustled with excitement about the party. She called me nearly every evening, planning decorations, choosing a cake, making sure the whole family would be there. Her joy was pure, untouched by suspicion. That innocence made my chest ache. She thought the gathering would be celebration. I knew it would be revelation. Mark and I prepared carefully. We organized the evidence into neat envelopes, each labeled and dated, copies of bank statements, the notary receipts, the county clerk's note, Mrs. Patel's doorbell videos, the audio file of David explaining trusteeships, even screenshots of Clara's messages. "Don't overwhelm them," Mark advised. "You only need enough to shatter the illusion. Once the mask slips, the rest will follow." I asked him more than once, "Will it destroy Emily?" He always answered the same, "The truth hurts. But lies rot. If you don't bring this into the light, she'll lose everything, including her faith in you for staying silent. So I prepared. The night before the party, I sat alone in the study with the strongbox open. The evidence lay inside like a silent jury, each page a witness waiting to speak. I read them again, though I didn't need to. I knew every line by heart now. Still, I traced the words with my finger, reminding myself that this wasn't imagination. It was fact. Cold, undeniable fact. Clara poked her head in, smiling faintly. "You're up late. Just paperwork," I said, closing the box. She stepped inside, placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't work too hard. Tomorrow will be a long day." I looked up at her hand, at the rings I had given her long ago, still glinting on her finger. Symbols of vows she had already broken. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to smile. "You're right," I said. "Tomorrow will be long." She kissed my cheek lightly and went to bed. I sat in the silence she left behind. My jaw clenched so hard it ached. The morning of the party, I dressed slowly, deliberately. I chose a clean white shirt, pressed slacks, and the old leather shoes I wore to Emily's wedding. They had carried me through joy once. Today they would carry me through something else entirely. In the mirror, I saw not a broken man, but a soldier preparing for battle. I slid the envelope of evidence into a leather case and locked it shut. My reflection held my gaze. "They think you're finished," I whispered to myself. "They think you'll stay quiet. Today they'll learn what silence was hiding." Emily arrived to pick me up, radiant in a blue dress, her hair pinned neatly. "Dad, you look sharp," she said, kissing my cheek. I smiled at her, the smile of a father who would die to protect his child. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." She didn't notice the weight of the case I carried to the car. She didn't notice how tightly I held it on my lap as we drove. At the venue, a rented hall buzzing with chatter and laughter, family members embraced old friends, clinked glasses, children darted between tables. It was a scene of warmth, of belonging. Clara stood near the buffet greeting relatives with open arms. David hovered close, his hand on her elbow, his smile effortless. They looked like hosts, not guests. I felt the burn of betrayal in my chest, but I held it down. My time was coming. I chose a seat near the center where everyone could see. The leather case sat by my chair, locked, waiting. Each tick of the clock pulled me closer to the moment. Clara glanced at me once across the room. Her smile was serene, almost pitying, as though she thought she was watching a man resigned to fading into the background. David caught her look and returned it with the faintest nod. They didn't know. They didn't know that tonight, before the candles were blown, before the cake was cut, their names would be spoken aloud, not as family, but as betrayers. I had always imagined betrayal as a single blow, sudden, brutal, final. But the truth is, betrayal is slow. It seeps into the cracks, fills the silence between words, clings to the corners of your house, until one day you wake up and realize you've been living with a stranger. By the time I gathered my evidence, by the time the case lay heavy in my hands, I understood that the real wound wasn't just the affair, or even the theft of my legacy. The real wound was knowing how easily love can be rewritten into deceit. In the nights leading up to the party, I barely slept. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to Clara's quiet breathing beside me. Once I reached out and almost touched her shoulder, out of habit, out of muscle memory. My hand hovered in the space between us, trembling with the weight of 30 years. But I pulled it back. I couldn't bring myself to bridge that distance anymore. She wasn't the girl from the bakery. She wasn't the woman who hummed lullabies over Emily's crib. She was someone else now, someone I didn't recognize, someone who had rehearsed lies until they rolled off her tongue smoother than the truth. The house became unbearable. Every corner held memories, the dent in the kitchen table from when Emily dropped her toy hammer, the faded spot on the wall where Clara once hung our wedding photo, the worn step on the porch where I used to sit after long days at the store. Each memory was like a ghost reminding me of what had been lost. I found myself moving through the rooms as though they were exhibits in a museum of a life that no longer belonged to me. Sometimes I wondered if I was partly to blame. Had I worked too much, left Clara too often in the quiet of the house while I buried myself in ledgers and invoices? Had I confused provision for presence, duty for love? These questions gnawed at me, but they didn't excuse what she had done. Choices are not accidents. She could have told me she was lonely. She could have asked for more. Instead, she chose secrecy. She chose David, and together they chose greed. And Emily, my sweet girl. She had no idea. She still believed her mother was her anchor, her husband, her partner, her family, her shield. How would she look at me when she learned the truth? Would she think I had failed to protect her? Would she blame herself? Wonder how she had missed the signs that thought kept me awake more than anything else? I could endure Clara's betrayal, David's theft, even the possibility of losing everything I owned, but the idea of Emily's innocence being shattered, that was almost too much to bear. I often sat with the strongbox open, the documents spread before me like an altar, receipts, statements, drafts of wills with my name erased. They stared back at me, cold and clinical proof of everything I'd lost. I hated them, yet I needed them. They were the only thing keeping me sane, reminding me I wasn't imagining it, that the darkness was real, and not just the invention of a tired old man. Sometimes I thought about burning it all, the papers, the evidence, the notebook. I imagined striking a match, watching the flames consume the lies, letting the ash drift away until nothing remained. There was a strange appeal in the idea of erasing it all, of pretending none of it had ever happened. But fire doesn't heal wounds, it only leaves scars. So I kept the evidence, and with it, I kept my resolve. Grief has a way of hollowing you out, but it also leaves space for something else: anger, determination, a quiet kind of strength. In the stillness of those sleepless nights, I discovered that I wasn't as broken as I thought. Pain can be a teacher, and mine had taught me clarity. I no longer wondered if I should act. I knew I would. I stood in front of the mirror one morning, adjusting my shirt collar, and for the first time in months, I didn't see a victim staring back. I saw a man, weathered by storms, but still standing. A man who had built something from nothing, who had carried his family on his back for decades, who would not be erased by lies. My face was lined, my eyes tired, but there was steel in them still. Clara thought I was finished. David thought I was naive. But they didn't understand what a man becomes when he has nothing left to lose. They didn't understand that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. I whispered to my reflection. They think they've already buried me. They don't know I'm the one digging. And for the first time since the night at the gate, I felt ready. Resolve does not arrive with fanfare. It slips in quietly, like the steady tightening of a knot, until one morning you realize you are no longer hesitating, you are planning. That morning came for me 2 weeks before Aunt Margaret's party. I woke before dawn, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, and opened my notebook. Instead of writing questions, I wrote instructions, not doubts, directives. First, safeguard the assets. I met with Mark again, this time not as a man begging for clarity, but as a client outlining a strategy. He filed the preliminary notices, confirmed that no deed or account could be altered without my consent, and placed standing orders with the banks. If they try to move anything, he said, you'll know before the ink dries. His voice carried the calm of someone who had seen men in my position before. The law is on your side, Daniel. But the law is slow. You need impact. That comes from exposure. Second, gather irrefutable proof. I copied the audio files of David's eager explanation, the doorbell camera videos Mrs. Patel had given me, the bank statements with their incriminating charges. I scanned every document and burned them onto discs, then stored the originals in separate envelopes. One I gave to Mark, another I sealed in a box beneath the floorboards of my office at the store. A third I carried with me, locked in the leather case. I knew redundancy was my shield. If Clara or David caught wind of my plan and tried to destroy the evidence, I would still have it. Third, choose the battleground. I had no interest in screaming matches behind closed doors. They could deny, twist, manipulate Emily's heart against me. But in a room full of family surrounded by witnesses, lies would falter. Their faces would betray them before their words could catch up. Aunt Margaret's birthday was perfect, a celebration, a stage, an audience of people who mattered. They expected cake and speeches. They would receive truth and judgment. In the days leading up to the party, I rehearsed in my mind, not lines. Truth does not need scripts, but composure. I practiced keeping my voice steady, my eyes direct, my words simple. Tonight, I want the family to know the truth. Clara and David have betrayed me, and more than me, they have betrayed Emily. Here is the proof. That was all I needed. The evidence would speak louder than I ever could. Clara remained oblivious. She floated through the house, humming, calling David when she thought I couldn't hear, smiling at me with a softness that was almost insulting. One evening, she set a plate in front of me and said, "You've seemed lighter lately, more at peace." "I am," I answered honestly. She mistook resolve for surrender. That was her mistake. David grew bolder too. He called me one afternoon, voice casual. "If you want, I can handle renewing the insurance on the store. Just sign a few papers and it'll be off your plate." I forced a chuckle. "You're a good man, David. Always looking out for me." If he could have seen my face, he would have realized how far from the truth those words were. The night before the party, I sat once more with my strongbox open. I laid out the documents, the photographs, the recordings. I studied them not to remind myself, but to steel myself. Each page was a bricks in the wall between who I had been, a trusting husband, a proud father, a generous father-in-law, and who I was now, a man ready to expose betrayal, no matter the cost. I touched the original will, the one that left everything to Emily, and whispered, "This is for you." Sleep did not come easily that night. My mind replayed images of what tomorrow would bring: the shock on Emily's face, the whispers among relatives, the silence that would fall when I opened the case. I feared the pain it would cause her, but I knew shielding her was no longer protection. Shielding her was complicity, and I would not be complicit. At dawn, I dressed carefully. Not for vanity, but for symbolism. A pressed shirt, polished shoes, the same jacket I wore at Emily's wedding. If Clara and David thought me a ghost today, I would remind them I was flesh and blood and still standing. I placed the envelope of evidence into the leather case, locked it, and carried it to the door. My hand lingered on the knob as I whispered to myself, "They think silence means weakness. Today, they'll learn it was preparation." For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not because the pain had lessened, but because I finally knew what to do with it. The hall buzzed with laughter, the clink of glasses, the rustle of dresses and jackets. Children darted between tables, their shouts echoing under the high ceiling. Aunt Margaret sat in the place of honor, smiling at everyone who came to hug her. To anyone watching, it was a perfect evening, warm, ordinary, safe. I sat near the center, the leather case resting at my feet. My palms were dry now, not trembling. The weight of the case wasn't a burden anymore. It was a promise. Across the room, Clara laughed too loudly at something David whispered in her ear. They looked comfortable, certain as if the world were already theirs. Emily moved between tables, radiant, oblivious, carrying plates of cake to cousins and uncles. Her joy was untainted, and for a fleeting moment my chest ached with the desire to leave it untouched. But innocence cannot be protected by silence. When the room settled, I rose slowly, the scrape of my chair cutting through the chatter. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. I picked up the case, set it on the table, and unlocked it with a click that echoed louder than it should have. "I won't take long," I said, my voice steady. "But tonight, before we celebrate, there's something the family needs to hear." Clara's smile froze. David's eyes narrowed, calculating. I opened the case and pulled out the first envelope. The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that falls when everyone senses a truth approaching. These papers, I continued, holding them high enough for the front row to see, show how trust can be twisted, how loyalty can be stolen. Not just from me, but from Emily, from all of us. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emily's face paled, confusion clouding her joy. I placed the envelope on the table with a soft thud. I will let the evidence speak. And as I reached for the recorder, as the tension thickened like thunder about to break, I saw Clara rise halfway from her chair, her lips parting in panic and David's hand tightening on her arm to hold her down. The room was about to change forever. If you were in my place, standing in that room, holding the truth while everyone you love is watching, what would you do? Would you reveal everything or keep the secret to protect your family's peace? Tell me in the comments, because I want to hear your heart. And if this story shook you, remember to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Take care of yourself tonight, rest well, and remember you are stronger than the storms you face. I'll meet you in the next story. Thank you for watching.